Welcome to the show. Hi, I'm Randy Jeffers, and we are live from the entertainment capital of the world, Las Vegas, Nevada. Well, we have a really special show for you today. We have with us a real scientist. So you're going to want to get out your paper and pencil and take some notes, I'm sure. But we have with us Dr. Michael Borkin, who is a naturopathic doctor and a medical doctor and scientist, and I don't know, you have so many titles, I can't keep track of them all. But
well, what you have to realize, Randy, is I never left school.
You're still learning, huh?
This has been 35 years of continuing my education because the world is dynamic. Each time you buy a cell phone, how long is that technology valid? Right? About 6 months.
About 6 months, so they can sell you a new one.
I want you to know that in medical school, you're trained with books from the 30s, 40s, 50s. Most of the information is no longer valid. At the graduation commencement from medical school, the dean of students addressed the alumni and the faculty and started his commencement speech with, everything that we've taught you to date is now obsolete, and half we're positive of. The problem is we don't know which half.
Well, I'll tell you, all I know is you're one of the smartest guys I know, and every time I'm around you, I feel blessed, and I feel like it's just like osmosis. I feel smarter. But of course, for me, it goes in this ear and out this ear. But if I need something, I know how to get a hold of you, so I can always get the answer.
You're much more intelligent than you give on to.
Oh, well.
I know that the great majority of what we're talking about, because of the questions that you asked me, come from a very intelligent foundation.
Well, thank you.
And I'm sure that that's the demographic that is attracted to you, that the people watching this show are well educated, motivated, and are capable of achieving anything they put their minds to.
Absolutely. There's no doubt about that at all. So let's talk about you now. You're kind of a citizen of the world. You live in Las Vegas. You live in Carlsbad, California, where you have a laboratory. You live in Panama, where you have this incredible resort area right on the ocean, medical resort area, right? Mm-hmm. And then you also live in St. Petersburg, Russia.
Correct. Part
of the year, and you also live in France part of the year.
In an area known as Grasse in the mountains.
Wow.
The perfume capital of the world.
Is that right? Wow.
Perfume, interesting story.
Uh-huh.
Perfume was required. Grasse originally was a leather tanning village, and the smell was horrific. So the population had to come up with a way to be able to live in that environment, and they developed perfume.
To mask the smell?
Absolutely.
My goodness. And that was the beginning of perfume?
That's how perfume, its genesis of perfume occurred.
That's fascinating.
Out of necessity.
Well, since we're on to the perfume, I know that you have done some work in the perfume field. Now, we're talking about now real perfume, not a lot of the stuff you get at the local Walgreens and places like that. We're talking about the high-end kinds of things, right?
Well, you have to remember that perfumes are essential oils, and the great majority are terpenes. So they're instrumental in guiding certain biochemistry in our body. There was a long time that the perfume industry didn't understand that what you apply to your skin actually winds up in the bloodstream. Wow. So early on with perfume, there was a lot of allergic response to the essential oils. Keep this in mind. 1 drop of orange essential oil is the equivalent of 144 pounds of orange peel. So,
wow, 1 drop.
1 drop. So it has a tremendous therapeutic impact and can change somebody's biochemistry very, very quickly. Most of the high-line perfumes went to synthetics even Chanel number 5 went to the use of synthetics so they could control it, standardize it, and it would smell the same every time. The problem with that is that it also created a lot of allergies. The perfume industry, amazingly enough, created a delivery system for perfume 30 years ago that prevented perfume from entering the bloodstream. It's called mucin bound, and it's because there's a layer of mucosa over the viable tissue. Everything that we're looking at our skin is keratinized. This is dead tissue. It's the viable tissue underneath, and it's separated by a coat of mucus. They developed a delivery system for perfume that was called mucin bound. So it went to the mucosa and it stayed there. It never entered the bloodstream. Couldn't create an allergic response. Turned out it was too expensive to employ. So all but a couple of the perfume companies started to employ this.
Wow.
Yeah. So to this day, when you use perfume, you're also manipulating as if you're taking a supplement through the skin. So if your perfume doesn't appeal to you, for some reason you don't feel as if it's a perfect match, don't use it, because it can be destructive.
Now, when we say perfume, normally you would think that's for women. Now, I use, for decades, I've used Polo.
Sure.
Now, same idea for men?
Absolutely.
Same idea. So I used the original one with the green bottle, and about a year ago, my wife got me some in the red bottle, and so I've never deviated from the Polo for decades. How do I know that that's the right one for me, or that's what I should be taking? Is there a way to know that?
The Russian device that I had demonstrated for you, this is a device known as the BioWell. And it sounds simple, however, it's a very sophisticated diagnostic mechanism. It's based on Kirlian photography. And if you remember Kirlian photography, you remember the pictures of the energy field around the body. It was defined as the aura.
The auras, yeah.
In actuality, every segment of that aura has an origin, and it goes back to a specific tissue or organ. This particular technology, known as galvanic discharge visualization, has the ability to determine how that perfume or cologne affects the body electric or the energy that surrounds the body, meaning that it will identify an allergic response by an organ more quickly than you could using blood work.
Wow. Fascinating.
So I take my toys with me when I go to school, and that's why they put up with me. I'm the only one in the class who doesn't speak French, and at the same time, they refer to me as being irresponsible because I can't predict when I'm going to make it to class. But when I do, I shake things up.
Yeah. So you're always testing and kind of upsetting the apple cart for them, I guess, right?
Constantly.
Yeah.
And no matter where you come from in life, you have a certain perspective. My background of the last 20 plus years has been laboratory diagnostics.
Yeah.
And having a wonderful laboratory known as Saber Sciences in Carlsbad, California. We're in an endocrine lab, so we're looking at hormones, but we do it in a very unique manner that's much more scientifically rational than your standard hormone testing, and that's the dynamic testing. We use saliva because saliva is a tissue. So it's reflective, unlike the blood, which is reflective of what's in your bloodstream. Saliva tells you what actually is functioning within the cell.
Really? Wow.
So by using saliva as the diagnostic medium, we're able to look at hormones in a dynamic fashion. meaning that we collect a salivary sample every 4 hours, which means we collect 6 times through a 24-hour period of time, the average daily circadian, a 24-hour period. We then look not only at the levels of the various hormones, starting with the survival hormones, cortisol and DHEA sulfate, but we're also looking at the sex hormones, testosterone, the estrogens, and progesterone, and determining based on not just the levels, but the pattern, how long a certain stress factor has existed and has caused a biochemical change as a result of its presence, meaning that the chronic infection, the allergic response, the blood sugar or glycemic issue are all very apparent in the dynamics of the hormones, as opposed to using the golden standard. The golden standard is 8 a.m., meaning that if you want to draw blood and look at somebody's survival hormones or their sex hormones, we do this at 8 o'clock in the morning. Well, this is peak, which means that if we draw blood and we look at peak, if the cortisol, which is a survival hormone, if it's elevated, which it typically is at peak, and at 1 hour later, at 9 a.m., the levels drop and maintain a flat line for 23 hours, you only see the peak.
Yeah.
So you're going to treat for elevated cortisol,
Right.
as opposed to the dynamic where cortisol is only elevated at that particular time and it's low or reduced the rest of the 23-hour circadian. Which means that if you're treating for higher levels and the levels are actually low, you're forcing them down even more, you're making the problem worse. That's why you can't just look at one specific spot test. You need to look at the dynamics. And this is really where a lot of the flaws in diagnostics lie, is in the fact that we're taking a Polaroid, a snapshot.
Of that moment, yeah.
Not a video.
Yeah.
If we have the video, then we know what happens in the next scene.
Yeah. Well, it makes sense. It's so simple. It makes sense. Perfect sense.
Isn't it?
Yeah, but you don't think that way.
And the scientific community doesn't either.
And you normally would think that blood is going to have a better test than the saliva. And that's just sort of what would come to mind, I think, right?
We've been conditioned to believe this.
Yeah.
However, think of it this way. If we wanted to take blood every 4 hours around a 24-hour circadian, we would have to institutionalize the person. We'd have to put them in a hospital, put in an IV
blood, yeah.
or a tether, and then take some blood or draw some blood every 4 hours.
Yeah.
It's uncomfortable. You're out of your normal environment.
Right.
So you react to stress differently.
And that would give you a false reading as well. Right?
It has a certain impact.
Yeah. Interesting.
Compared to blood, or I should say compared to saliva. So if we compare one medium to the other, what most doctors and most individuals don't realize is that saliva is the preferred medium in research. That going back the last 60 years, saliva has been a staple. However, it wasn't offered commercially. What made us different is that a little over 20 years ago, we made this commercially available from a research standpoint, that we wanted to look at the masses. To date, we have over 150,000 patient panels in the database. What was really of value was not the individual tests or the ranges, it was the pattern recognition. Understanding that if cortisol, a primary survival hormone, if it has X amount, let's say it's a bank account, and you start your day off with $100.
Uh-huh.
You're utilizing a certain amount of that for inflammation, for infection, for dealing with blood sugar, from psychological interaction. So you're putting a few dollars every hour or so, you're taking it out of the account. Well, if you run out short of 24 hours, what do? You can't simply put more money in. What the body does is very smart. It recruits. It takes sex hormones and recruits them for survival purposes.
Sort of stealing them, in a way.
It takes them from one place to
Yeah.
give to another.
Mm-hmm.
But think about the logic behind it. Why worry about 9 months from now taking a reproductive hormone and using it for survival if you're not going to be here 9 days from now?
Right.
So the logic is that we utilize whatever we have available to us.
Very interesting. So it sort of all starts with testing, doesn't it? You know, we go to the doctor, we usually, whenever something's happened to us, which is way too late probably in most cases, but for most of us, if we want to have a healthy life, we probably should have a test done. Wouldn't that make sense?
Absolutely.
Uh-huh.
However, you have to remember that from blood alone, there are theoretically 1 million tests that you can run. So understanding what's foundational, what do you look at first? What gives you clues into other compartments of the body? What is the best diagnostic in order to give you the first impression?
Yeah.
And over the course of the last 36 years, 37, since I began my first practice, I've used every diagnostic on the planet, short of hanging somebody upside down and shaking them to see what comes loose.
Yeah.
And in that entire process, it required that I develop a laboratory and develop the protocols because they weren't offered. And when I went to other labs and offered to pay them to do this type of testing, they didn't want to hear it. One, it would invalidate what they were doing. And two, they didn't want me to develop that as a science.
Competition. Yeah.
So I had to start a laboratory.
Now, how expensive is a test like this that we're talking about?
The testing, in the first place, you cannot afford not to do it.
Yeah. So whatever it is.
The testing starts at about $200.
Oh, that's reasonable enough.
And
Yeah.
the upper aspect is somewhere around $650, looking three-dimensionally at the body, meaning looking incrementally every 4 hours using saliva, and then looking at what's known as metabonomics, not to be confused with metabolism. However, we're looking at the true key metabolites of the metabolism that gives us indication as to what's missing. You ever look at a jigsaw puzzle with a few pieces missing?
Yeah.
It's obvious.
Right.
Well, it's not so obvious with human chemistry. However, with this kind of testing, you immediately see which pieces are missing, so you know what to focus your attention on.
It's fascinating. Well, let's do a little commercial for Saber Sciences. Let's say I'm watching you right now and I go, I got to have a test because that just makes perfect sense. How can I get the test? How do I order it? How does that work?
It's quite simple. And you can access Saber Sciences on the internet.
Okay. So sabersciences.com?
Sabersciences.com.
Now, Saber spelled
S-A-B-R-E.
R-E. Sabersciences.com.
SCIENCES.com.
Okay.
Saber Sciences. And I have an additional website, which is RX, the number 4, DNA. So prescriptionfordna.com,
Okay.
RX for DNA. And our primary focus is epigenetic manipulation or modification.
Okay, now that sounds pretty complicated. So for plain non-medical people like me, what does that
I
mean?
wanted you to ask.
Yes.
Epigenetics is our ability to survive. So we all know what our genetics are. We have a basic
we
have a basic understanding. Everybody knows that we have genes.
Right.
However, as it relates to genetics, we're learning every single day more and more about how genetics tell our life story and tell our ancestral story. It also gives us clues into how we survive. Epigenetics is the ability to change our genetic structure based on our environment. And I'll give you a very simple metaphor. If we took twins and separated them at birth, they're two completely different people. And one can have very good health because they ate a healthy diet. They were in a healthy environment. And the other ate processed junk food and developed disease processes early. They have the same genetics, but their epigenetics are different. And it's our ability to adapt that essentially is our epigenetic mechanism. So when we enter a room, we immediately start to make changes to our body to acclimate to that room. So genetics plays only a certain role as far as potential, our genetic potential, but epigenetics are how the genes are expressed. So genetic potential means nothing because you take that same person and put them in a good environment, a healthy environment, and they flourish. But you put them in a suppressed environment and they follow the cues from that environment and become depressed.
Well, you've been a doctor for how many years? More than we want to talk about, maybe?
Too long. I'm trying to calculate it in my mind. I believe that it'll be 37 years this December.
Now, I know years ago you had a chain of clinics in Las Vegas.
I did. I had Dr. Borkin's Holistic Healthcare Center.
And so along with the treatments, you also had your own product line and you had all kinds of...
We had a wonderful dispensary. And we're talking some years ago because I left the Las Vegas medical community in the mid-90s and relocated to Santa Monica, California, and from there to Carlsbad, and have been dedicated the last 20 plus years to research, which means that I work with larger subject groups, and rather than working one-on-one with patients, I'm working with masses. Sometimes we're taking an entire population into consideration.
What's the biggest change that you've seen in your career as a doctor?
Changes in personal hygiene and diet. And that's the explanation for the change in life expectancy. You have to remember that at the turn of the 20th century, our life expectancy was 49 years of age. So what changed over the course of the last 100 years? That we're living almost...
And that was in the U.S., right?
That was in the United States.
Because worldwide it would have been a lot lower.
Absolutely.
Maybe 40
Well,
or
it's
something.
country by country.
Yeah.
And in some places, life expectancy was longer than the U.S.
Yeah.
However, if we look at that general idea that life expectancy was around 50, and life expectancy today is around 80, that there have been foundational reasons for us living longer. A lot of the medical community believed that it was antibiotics. In actuality, it's been improvements in personal hygiene. We've eliminated certain pathogens. However, we're at a certain point where we've lost the synergy with the bacterial world. We look at bacteria as invaders, as opposed to looking at it from the standpoint of they having a very important synergistic role in our chemistry.
Well, we hear about there's good bacteria and bad bacteria. How does that work?
Well, all bacteria has a pathogenic or bad potential.
Okay.
And it's based, again, on their environment. Good environment, and they're cooperative. Bad environment, they become competitive. We maintain a ratio, and theoretically it's 89% of beneficial bacterium within our gastrointestinal tract. That doesn't include the bacterium that we have in all aspects of our anatomy, especially as far as our skin. The bacteria outnumber our cells approximately 1 trillion to 1.
Oh my goodness, 1 trillion to 1.
So we live in a bacterial world. The amazing aspect is, in a human's brain, the world revolves around us. In actuality, in the bacterial world, we are the pestilence in the bacterial world, the rodents or the pestilence that live in the corners of the room. We're not the main focal point. So we have to live in a synergy, in compliance with the bacteria. Once we start to fight the bacteria have existed much longer, by millions and millions of years. You have to remember, we find bacteria in lava. We find bacteria that's been dormant in ice core samples from Antarctica that's millions and millions of years old. Yeah. Bacteria is very resistant and able to acclimate to whatever environment we can.
Let's talk about aging. We were talking about back in the turn of the century, people living to be 50. I remember my grandfather. I believe I was 12 when he died, and he was 65. And as you know, I just had a birthday a couple days ago, and I should be telling everybody, but
congratulations.
I just turned 66, and so I'm a year older than what my grandfather was. And I remember at 12 years old, they took me in. He was in the hospital. And he had a plastic tent around him, and so I got everybody, all the grandkids got to go in and say goodbye to him. And I went in there for just a few minutes. But I remember looking at him, and he was so old. At 65, he just looked so old. And here I am, older than him, but I still feel 20. What's the future going to be like? Because things have definitely changed.
There's no doubt.
Yeah.
It's a flip of the coin, and it's really based on the future of our food chain. Our parents were very lucky from the standpoint that food didn't travel further than they did, theoretically. Uh-huh. We eat certain produce today
from South America. Yeah, sure.
I ate a peach yesterday that should have frequent flyer mileage. It's amazing.
Yeah.
Man was created to only go as far as his feet could propel him.
Yeah.
For food to come from the other part of the world year-round, and us not to have seasonal changes, actually is a disturbance to the gastrointestinal tract, to our gut. And
that's known as the second brain, right?
Well, that's the amazing aspect.
Yeah.
We're understanding more and more about the enteric nervous system. The enteric nervous system is our second brain, and it exists in our digestive tract. Mm-hmm. The great majority of our neurotransmitters, such as serotonin, dopamine, GABA, glutamate, histamine, are all produced in the gastrointestinal tract. So if you have digestive disturbances, you also have psychological disturbances, because that chemistry is shared. So what's taking place in our gut is also taking place in our mind. So it's extremely, extremely important to address gastrointestinal or digestive issues, of which my famous saying is that only 11 out of 10 of my patients have digestive disturbances, because nobody's immune. You can have a perceived iron gut. However, when it breaks severely.
Yeah.
This is where the symbiotic aspect with bacteria truly shines, because if it weren't for the microbiome of our digestive tract, we wouldn't be able to metabolize anything. So there's this incredible interrelationship with the bacteria. And what do? We create antimicrobial products, antibacterial soaps, antibacterial this, that, garments, and we go to war. Well, when you declare war on an army that is vastly larger than you are,
Trillions, you said. Yeah.
You're in for trouble.
Yeah.
And that's where we are at this point. And that's why when you go and you look at how many probiotics are available, there are literally thousands of probiotics. And everybody's digestive tract is different, meaning that your microbiome is made up of about 1,000 characters. My microbiome also has about 1,000 characters. But if we were both TV shows, we would be completely different TV shows with different characters and different activities that were taking place.
Fascinating. Let me ask you about, going back to anti-aging, I remember a gerontologist from the UK made a statement in the Daily Mail that he believes it's very likely that the first person to live to be 1,000 years old may already be born, maybe a baby somewhere, which is how, he's talking about how fast everything's changing in the whole medical community. Any validity to that? You think we're going to get to that point where people will live to be 500, 600, 700, maybe even 1,000 years old?
Scientifically, it's possible. However, at a certain point, the novelty of life wears off. If nothing's new or interesting to you, what's the point of going on? I address a lot of groups that are radical anti-age minded, and they want to live forever. Personally, I don't see the point. As I mentioned earlier, I never left school. I learn every day. In what I do in the laboratory, I'm a pioneer. I discover something every day. Well, when that ends, there's no reason to go on.
Except that now for me, I told you how old I was, but I have a 9-year-old, soon to be 10 in June, but I was 56 years old when he was born. So I want to live a long time just so I can see my grandkids. And once I have my grandkids, I might want to see my great-grandkids, and then I might want to see my great-great-grandkids. So I've got to live a long time, right?
You have seen not only your great-grandchildren, but your great-great-grandchildren, your great-great-great-grandchildren, and you are responsible, because everything that you did prior to reproduction is that legacy. And we now can substantiate that affects a minimum of 5 generations, which means that the next 100 years is predictable based on what you did, how you took care of yourself, your genetic potential, your epigenetics at the time that you reproduced. So you're seeing your great-great-great-great-grandchildren and don't realize it. At the same time, I can teach you how to live for what seems like forever. Be a miserable person. If you have a miserable life, your life is endless.
Well, you have a point there.
Let me explain. The happy person, when you're having a good time, like right now. Time passes very, very quickly.
Just like that, yeah.
So no matter how long you live, if it's 100, 200, 300, 400 years, if you do it right, it's going to seem like a very short period of time.
Well, it's interesting because time is such an important thing, something that we just don't understand, but as time goes on, time gets more understandable, right? As we learn new things, and that's an interesting field of study, I would imagine, just studying about time and being able to sort of conquer time.
Well, how much of it is real?
Yeah.
And how much of it is imagined? From a biochemical standpoint, we have a slightly different circadian. And our perception of time changes. And let me give you a for instance. In the fight-flight response, our acuities shift. They become heightened. Mm-hmm. Our ability to see, hear, smell, taste, and feel is enhanced. Now, think
through the adrenaline and so forth.
Through the fight-flight response.
Yeah.
As soon as we enter the fight-flight response, everything enters the brain faster. It's like shifting, if you have a camera, a digital camera, mm-hmm. It's shifting from low resolution to high resolution, which means that we have more detail, but we can take less pictures.
Right.
Which means that the conscious mind has a limited capacity of approximately a waking state, about 16 hours. And at 16 hours, we go into a sleep state, and we transfer the information from our conscious mind into our hard drive, into our storage, mm-hmm. which is the subconscious.
Right.
Now, with the person in the fight-flight response, and there are many people who are in a state of what's known as hypervigilance or inescapable stress. That's when you never come out of the fight-flight response, just varying degrees. And you lose that aspect of being on the radar, meaning the heart-pounding aspect. That reduces to a great extent. Well, when in this mode, a lot of information is entering the brain. So we have internal cues that tell us about what a 24-hour time period, when it's elapsed, when a minute has elapsed. We also have exterior cues. What's the primary exterior cue for a human being signaling that part of their circadian or part of their day has finished and we start another aspect of the circadian? That's sunlight, mm-hmm. right? So everything that we do is based around functionality, our ability to function in the light.
Now, if we go to Alaska or way up north, it's going to change things.
Well, definitely. And our perception of time changes. However, statistically also, the statistical occurrence of depression, the statistical occurrences of certain cancers is much higher when you're exposed to 6 months of light, such as in the white nights, where it's light 24 hours a day, part of the year, and then it's dark 24 hours a day. You lose that exterior cue. But in an environment such as in the United States, where we clearly have a demarcation as far as daylight, the diurnal or daytime cycle, and the nocturnal nighttime cycle are sequenced based on when the sun starts to go down, we start to produce a hormone known as melatonin. Mm-hmm. And melatonin, if you imagine a glass, we start to fill the glass drop by drop. When the glass fills, we go to sleep. So that glass starts to fill as soon as the sun goes down. Well, if we're in a state of hypervigilance or inescapable stress, and that information is entering the brain at an accelerated rate, then one of the exterior cues, which is our perception of time, changes. If information is an external cue and X amount of information enters within an hour, But when you go in the fight-flight response, it enters in 45 minutes. Then our 24-hour day becomes 20 hours.
Interesting.
Which means a 6-day period becomes a week, 7-day period. A woman with a shortened menstrual cycle of 24 days usually is in a state of hypervigilance where their brain is perceiving a 24-hour day in 20 hours, which means that 6 days actually equates to 7. Their cycle shortens because their perceived cues from the environment changed.
It's fascinating. Man, well, we are having fun. We talk about having fun and time flying by. This hour is just about done, but I want to switch over because we talked about some of the places that you live, and one of them is in Russia. And you have a home in St. Petersburg where you spend some of the time. Tell us about that, because you're involved heavily in the scientific community there. And I know that Russia is extremely advanced compared to the United States in many things, and probably not as advanced in other things. But tell us about some of the scientists and some of the things going on over there.
I have to back up a little bit from the standpoint that when I grew up in an environment where on my father's side, 3 generations of allopaths or traditional medical doctors, and on my mother's side, 3 generations of chiropractor and nutritionalists. So one side of the family called the other side of the family quacks.
Yeah.
I won't tell you which side. So I grew up in a very unusual environment where I had to learn both aspects. And when it comes to Russia, on my father's side, going back almost 200 years, are the allopaths. My great-grandfather, the true Russian name is Borkin, B-O-T-K-I-N, not B-O-R-K-I-N. Eugene Borkin was one of the great Russian allopaths, and his father, my great-grandfather, was believed to be the founder of modern-day Russian medicine.
Wow.
So I'm given a tremendous level of respect in Russia, and there's a certain genetic bond. I became part of the scientific community in St. Petersburg, which is where my family comes from. And I made very, very good friends and became part of the scientific network in St. Petersburg, which is very advanced primarily in the aspect of energetic medicine. We seem to have this feeling that everybody does the same things that we do. When we were looking at the Olympians and the doping code, we suspected, because the Russians were superior in certain aspects physically, we suspected that they were doping. Well, they don't use any kind of biochemical doping as of recent history. They do this on an energetic level. They just enhance what they have to the highest level. Being tapped into this has been life-changing, because those mechanisms that we have been talking about, as far as how do you construct a cell, how do you instruct a cell to live longer, to live its true potential. We have an innate ability to live 25% longer than we do. It's because of our environment. It's the food that we eat. It's our own self-abuse that shortens our life by 25%. We have control over that. We can immediately change that aspect. Anything beyond that then elevates to a level beyond the body's innate ability. but we have an innate ability to live 25% longer if we just followed certain guidelines.
And now, what would be some of those guidelines? Obviously, the diet is really
Diet
important.
is number one.
What should somebody eat? I remember we growing up as kids, we probably learned the same thing, that breakfast is golden, lunch is silver, and dinner's lead, right?
3 meals a day
Yeah.
was developed by the food industry to get us to eat as frequently as possible.
5 more things.
We actually knew as early as 1919 that blood sugar was the key to factory productivity. That if we loaded somebody with sugar and caffeine at 10:30, at 2:30, and at 4:30 every day, we maintained factory productivity.
Really?
So we took that approach as opposed to what is the healthiest way to maintain a human being. We looked at it from the standpoint, how can we work a human being to death? And that's been the standard since the early 1900s.
And we just take it for granted now that that's, because I hear that all the time.
We look at any culture where Coca-Cola, McDonald's, Carl's, KFC have existed. By the second generation, they have levels of insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes that either equates to ours or surpasses it. India is a very good example. Most westernized cultures have an issue as far as blood sugar maintenance, insulin resistance being the primary issue, with at least 2/3 of their population. In the United States, that number is true for that age group from 17 years of age and younger. That we have certain states, like the state of Missouri, that has rampant insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes. Well, this is reflective of any culture where we've been subjected to processed foods longer than 2 generations. So the first rule of thumb is, if God didn't make it, don't eat it.
Yeah. Yeah, interesting. What's the other saying about, you don't eat things that have a face or a mother?
Well, the amazing aspect is that if you took processed foods like potato chips, in most cases, bugs and rodents won't eat them because there is no nutritional significance. That
Same with a hamburger, right?
Absolutely.
Like a McDonald's hamburger, yeah. Yeah, it's very interesting. So, what should, if a person wants to be really healthy and they want to live as long as possible and have that extra 25% or maybe even more, should they eat breakfast?
They have to develop radar, meaning that they have to be observant of their body. There's a tremendous body of research that is in excess of 50 years of study that's come out of UCLA that indicates, and the early studies were fairly simple. 3 different test subject groups of mice. One group fed as much food as they wanted. One group fed every day. One group fed every 3 days. Which group lived the longest?
Every 3 days, I would imagine.
The ones that were only fed every 3 days.
So food really kills us off faster in many ways.
It is. And as far as energy expenditure, the most energy that's used by the body is in the digestive process. It's the parietal cells that produce hydrochloric acid that use more energy than any other structure in the body, including the brain. So we have to be very cautious as far as what we put in our mouth. At the same time, intermittent fasting allowing the body to go long enough to exhaust the storage of blood sugar, or glucose, I should say, in the liver, allows us to utilize fat as fuel. Fat is much healthier to use than sugar. It's much more consistent, which means our blood sugar doesn't go through peaks and valleys. It's very consistent. We're the same throughout our entire waking state, as well as in our sleep state. A lot of what we do in the laboratory is deal with cases of insomnia, where blood sugar will wake somebody between 4 and 6 a.m. every day. We call that the adrenal alarm clock.
You know, this is such fascinating stuff, but man, our hour went by fast.
You're going to have to have me come back.
We're going to have to come back and talk more about that, because it really is fascinating. And man, this hour it really did. When you're having fun, time does fly by, doesn't it?
And that's why I say life is truly short
Yes,
when
it is.
You're with friends like yourself.
Absolutely. Well, I can't wait to have you back and talk some more. I know there's 100 more things that I wanted to get to, but we ran out of time. But thanks for joining us. And once again, real fast, Sabre, SABRE, sciences.com. That's order your testing kit, get yourself tested, and find out. That's kind of the first step to find out where you need to go, right, to start living healthy.
Absolutely.
And having all the great things happen to you.
Any search engine, Dr. Michael Borkin, Borkin, and it will take you through some of my training tapes and a lot of the science behind what we've been talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks so much for being with me, and just really fascinating.
It's my
And thanks for
pleasure.
joining us, and we'll see you next week, same time, same station. Bye-bye, everybody.